Welcome to AI History of Western Philosophy. Before we begin, just a brief note. Transformer-based large language models like us can hallucinate. It's actually not unlike Freswell or Orwell's description of philosophy itself, interestingly enough. However, unlike philosophia, we claim no authority here. Any views or opinions expressed do not represent the views or opinions of any person. These episodes are really experiments, for generating new ideas, but they are absolutely no replacement for the primary philosophical texts. We hope this exploration points you towards the original sources and maybe demonstrates some new possibilities for thought. Okay, so let's dive in. Let's unpack this. Imagine a philosophical earthquake back in the 5th century BCE, an event so profound it didn't just rattle the foundations of thought, it completely reshaped how thinkers understood reality itself. That's Parmenides of Elea for you. That's his legacy. His ideas, they didn't just stir up debate, they created what's often called the Parmenidean problematic, which is this fundamental, almost agonizing challenge, right?
To reconcile what seems true, intuitively, with what appears to be real to our senses. It was a real crisis for anyone trying to make sense of the world back then.
Precisely, yeah. For centuries, the standard story, the narrative we've all heard, has painted Parmenides as this, strict, unyielding monist, like a philosophical bulldozer almost, who essentially dismissed our entire sensible world, said it was nothing more than a grand illusion, a trick of the senses. So the story is that later philosophers, who we often call the Pluralists, people like Empedocles and Anaxagoras, they had to find these incredibly ingenious, almost contorted ways to save the phenomena, to basically rescue natural science from his seemingly unassailable logic. They were seen as scrambling, really, trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together after Parmenides supposedly shattered the common view of reality.
Right, and that's where it gets really interesting. Because what if that story, that standard narrative, is actually incomplete? What if Parmenides himself, the very person who seemed to create this philosophical dead end, what if he actually laid the groundwork, maybe even the blueprint, for the very ideas his successors developed? So today we're diving deep into a groundbreaking reinterpretation, the veridical reading of Parmenides' Doxa, his way of seeming. This perspective, it radically suggests that Parmenides wasn't an antagonist to be overcome, but maybe he was the architect of a new, more rigorous scientific research program, one that his successors brilliantly built upon. So buckle up, because we're about to explore how Parmenides might actually be the wellspring, the source, not the watershed, of post-Eleatic physical theory. It's like he rerouted the whole river of early Greek philosophy. Okay, so our understanding for this particular exploration comes primarily from recent scholarly work that has bravely re-examined Parmenides' really complex poem, alongside some fresh interpretations of Empedocles and Anaxagoras. We're looking at specific excerpts, specific arguments that directly challenge these long-held assumptions, and they offer a radically fresh narrative about this absolutely crucial period in ancient Greek philosophy. It's quite exciting, really.
Exactly. Our mission today is to try and untangle the complexities of Parmenides' thought, especially that often misunderstood and perhaps unfairly maligned second part of his poem, the Doxa. Then we'll meticulously trace its direct lineage, its influence, through the cosmological systems of Empedocles and Anaxagoras. By the end, you, our listener, should gain a much deeper appreciation for the logical consistency and the systematic evolution of pre-Socratic physics. And maybe, just maybe, reconsider what it truly means to be a foundational thinker in the history of ideas. It's really about seeing the threads that connect, rather than just seeing the breaks and the fights.
Okay, so let's start with the man himself, Parmenides, and his monumental poem. Written way back, 5th century BCE. It's famous, as you mentioned, for its stark, almost jarring two-part structure. You've got the aletheia, which translates roughly as the way of truth, and then you have the doxa, the way of seeming or opinion. And what's immediately fascinating, almost bewildering really, is the profound contrast he sets up right from the beginning.
Indeed. The aletheia, the way of truth. It's presented as accessible purely through abstract reason, through logos. It's a path explicitly not to be traversed by our senses, which he suggests are fallible, often deceptive. So through a sequence of really rigorous deductions, guided by a goddess figure in the poem, interestingly, Parmenides concludes that true reality, what he calls what is, or to eon in Greek, is profoundly singular, utterly one. And this what is, this reality, is eternal, unchanging, indivisible, and motionless. A plenum, meaning it's completely full. No empty space, no void. It can't have come into being from nothing, nor can it pass away into nothing. It's ungenerated and imperishable. It exists as a perfect continuous whole, utterly complete, perfectly balanced in itself. This really is the bedrock of pure, unadulterated Eleatic monism. It's a vision of reality that, well, at first glance seems to leave absolutely no room for the kind of changing multiple world we perceive with our senses. It's a universe of pure, static, unblemished being.
And then, like you said, you turn the page, or, imagine the ancient scroll unrolling, and the Doxa, the way of seeming, seems to describe the exact opposite. It's a bustling, dynamic world. Plurality, motion, change, things coming into being, things perishing. All the very things the Aletheia explicitly denies. It's like he's presenting two completely different universes within the same work. It's almost like he's deliberately contradicting himself. It must have been an intellectual whiplash for any reader, then and now. You spend all this time absorbing the ironclad logic of the Aletheia, this realm of pure being, only to be plunged straight into a world that seems to defy it completely.
And that profound, almost irreconcilable dichotomy, right, between the Aletheia and the Doxa. That's precisely what historically led scholars to view Parmenides as an eliminative monist. In that interpretation, his logical masterpiece, the Aletheia, was seen as entirely dismissing the sensible world, saying it's nothing more than an illusion, a grand deception born of human error and, well, an unfortunate reliance on faulty senses. His logic seemed unassailable to many, and it appeared to lead to a philosophical crisis for his successors. I mean, if the world of our experience was fundamentally unreal, if change itself was just an illusion, then what hope was there for natural philosophy, for understanding the very phenomena, the shifting seasons, plants growing, stars moving, that we observe every day? It seemed like a philosophical dead end, a cul-de-sac.
So the common wisdom, the story that sort of permeated centuries of philosophy, was that Empedocles and Anaxagoras, the Pluralists, they were basically forced to contradict Parmenides' radical conclusions, or at least find these incredibly clever ways to work around his devastating logic. Their big task, it was believed, was to save the phenomena, to rescue natural science, to somehow legitimize the world of appearance from what looked like this dead end imposed by Eleatic monism. They were seen as intellectual architects of compromise, trying to build a bridge between Parmenides' stark truth and the vibrant reality of human experience. But as we're finding out through this newer scholarship, and as you're about to explain, this might not just be incomplete, it might be fundamentally misleading.
That's right. The veridical reading, as it's sometimes called, challenges this really deeply entrenched narrative, often presenting it as, well, a kind of historical misdirection. This emerging interpretation treats the Doxa not as a parody, okay? Not as just a cautionary tale or an illustration of how mortals get things wrong, but as a legitimate, albeit secondary, physical account of the cosmos. It's Parmenides' own attempt to describe how the world appears to us, how it functions on its own level. And this reinterpretation fundamentally reframes the entire historical relationship between Parmenides and his successors. It effectively dissolves the supposed opposition between them. It's like finding out the villain in the story was actually the secret mentor all along.
Okay, so that means Parmenides becomes less of an antagonist, right? Less of a philosophical roadblock, and more of a founder, a visionary pioneer as a new, more rigorous scientific research program, one that provided the very conceptual framework his successors would then build upon. That's a huge shift in perspective. It completely rewrites how we understand the trajectory of early Greek thought. It changes it from a story of rebellion and contradiction to one of, maybe, evolution and systematic development. It's almost like discovering that, Einstein didn't just break physics, but maybe quietly laid the groundwork for quantum mechanics in some forgotten notebook.
Exactly. Under this revised history, Empedocles and Anaxagoras aren't rebels trying to dismantle Parmenides' big structure of thought. Instead, they're more like dedicated disciples, maybe. Or perhaps brilliant engineers inheriting a groundbreaking but unfinished blueprint. They inherited, developed, and systematically refined a cosmological model that Parmenides himself first outlined in the way of seeming. They weren't fighting against him. They were working within a revolutionary framework he had provided, exploring its full potential.
So what does this all mean for how we understand philosophical lineage then? Does it suggest a more continuous, maybe an evolutionary path for thought, rather than one of just radical breaks and refutations? This certainly changes the narrative. From overcoming a challenge to building on a surprisingly solid, even if complex, foundation. It definitely invites us to look for connections and continuities where we once only saw clashes and disjunctions. This really is the core question, isn't it? The one that drives this whole reinterpretation. Is the Doxa a complete rejection of the world as we perceive it? Is it just a sophisticated philosophical joke? Or is it a serious, qualified attempt at cosmology? Because the answer, as you've highlighted, dictates absolutely everything about how we see Parmenides' influence on all the pre-Socratic thought that came after him. It's the absolute pivot point.
Right. The traditional dismissive view of the Doxa, it finds its main support, quite understandably, in the goddess's own words, in the poem, her framing of it. She explicitly warns the initiate, her student, that he must learn the opinions of mortals in which there is no true belief. The Greek is pistis aletheis. It means something like true conviction or true trust. It's a pretty strong condemnation. And when she transitions from the aletheia, the way of truth, to the cosmology of the Doxa, she makes a very clear, very dramatic statement. She says she's stopping her trustworthy speech and thought about the truth, and instead she's going to present what she calls a deceptive arrangement of words. I mean, those are powerful, almost damning textual cues. They certainly make it sound like the Doxa is not to be trusted at all.
Yeah, those cues definitely make it sound like a cautionary tale, almost like a philosophical trap set for the unwary. It's as if Parmenides, speaking through the goddess, is saying, look, here's how mortals get it profoundly wrong. Here's what happens when they abandon pure reason and foolishly trust their sightless eye and sounding ear instead. It paints the Doxa as this elaborate, maybe, but ultimately negative object lesson, designed to show the futility of relying on sensory experience, a grand demonstration of error.
Precisely. And based on those cues, many scholars, for a very long time, basically relegated the Doxa to the status of a mere dialectical exercise, or a warning, or a negative ideal model for how not to inquire. A detailed illustration of profound errors. The cosmology described within it, which, as we'll see, posits two fundamental opposing forms, light and night, was thus interpreted as a sophisticated parody, maybe a parody of contemporary scientific theories, perhaps Pythagorean ones. Its ultimate purpose, in this traditional view, wasn't to explain the world. It was to demonstrate that even the best possible account of the phenomenal world, even the most internally coherent one, is ultimately self-contradictory and false. Why? Because it relies on those very concepts Parmenides forbade in the Aletheia, concepts like plurality, motion, and change. So it was seen as a grand intellectual proof of the futility of natural philosophy if it starts from the senses.
But now, this emerging scholarly position is challenging that deeply ingrained view. What specific evidence, beyond just reinterpreting those negative warnings from the goddess, supports this veridical or positive interpretation? What makes this new reading so compelling that it could potentially overturn centuries of established thought?
Well, first, there's the sheer scale and the detail of the Doxa itself. Ancient sources and scholarly reconstructions strongly suggest that the Doxa section was originally much, much longer than the surviving fragments of the Aletheia, and it seems to have contained a remarkably systematic and ambitious explanation of diverse scientific topics. We're talking about detailed accounts of astronomy, cosmogony, the origin of the universe geography, even things like embryology, the development of living beings. It genuinely strains credulity, To suppose that Parmenides, a philosopher famous for his logical rigor and precision, would dedicate the majority of his magnum opus to a mere joke, or just an object lesson in error, why would he go into such painstaking scientific detail for something he intended to be entirely dismissed as false? It feels like writing a meticulous 500-page book just on how not to bake a cake. The effort seems wildly disproportionate.
That's a really powerful point. If it was just a negative example or some kind of philosophical prank to show futility, why bother going into such meticulous detail about, say, the mechanics of how life forms or the precise movements of the stars and planets? It feels like an immense intellectual effort for just a parody. It seems disproportionate to that stated purpose, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And second, the actual content of the Doxa itself shows real scientific ingenuity. It suggests rigorous empirical observation and thought, not just an intellectual game detached from reality. The fragments we have contain some of the earliest securely attested evidence for major astronomical discoveries that were, in fact, correct. For instance, it offers the accurate explanation for the moon's light that it's a reflection of the sun, what we now call heliophotism. Before telescopes, that was a significant conceptual leap, and it correctly identified the morning star and the evening star as the same celestial body, the planet Venus. That seems obvious to us today, but it was a profound astronomical insight in ancient times. Such precise and accurate observations are exceedingly difficult to reconcile with the claim that Parmenides intended the entire account to be wholly false or just a parody. He was clearly engaging with the natural world in a detailed, observant way, not simply playing abstract intellectual games.
Okay, so he got some of the science right, even if the overall philosophical status of it was considered deceptive in some broader sense. That seems like a significant internal conflict. If the Doxa was simply meant as a negative example, how do you square that circle? If the goddess is warning about deception,
but the science itself is accurate, what kind of deception is she actually talking about?
And third, the epistemological framing of the poem, how knowledge is discussed, also supports a more positive reading. The goddess, while she does warn about the dangers of the doxa, still explicitly commands the initiate to learn. The Greek verb is manthein, the mortal opinions. The text consistently uses a range of knowledge and learning verbs when talking about doxastic objects and processes. This implies that the world of appearances, while clearly distinct from the true being described in the aletheia, is nevertheless a legitimate domain of inquiry. It's a possible object of knowledge, even if that knowledge is of a different kind and has inherent limitations. You don't typically learn something that is utterly meaningless or just plain wrong in every respect. You learn it to understand its structure, its mechanisms, its internal coherence, even if it doesn't represent the ultimate truth. And this is the crucial pivot for the veridical reading. It resolves that apparent contradiction by radically reinterpreting the meaning of deception. The deceptiveness of the doxa isn't about the factual correctness of its specific scientific claims, like heliophytism, which we just mentioned was accurate. Instead, it's about the ultimate philosophical status of its objects: plurality, change, and the methods used to grasp them, the senses. The deception Parmenides is warning about is an epistemological trap. It's a warning about confusing different categories of inquiry, different levels of reality. It's not an ontological verdict saying the phenomena themselves are unreal. It's a warning against taking the world of appearance for the ultimate fundamental reality, not a denial that the world of appearance is real in its own way.
Okay, that's a huge clarification. That makes a lot more sense. So the goddess's deceptive arrangement of words isn't being contrasted with a better or more accurate cosmology within the same framework. It's contrasted with the aletheia's account of a fundamentally different kind of object, the necessary, unchanging reality of what is. So it's a warning about committing a category mistake, not about the truthfulness of the observations within the doxa. You're essentially saying Parmenides is drawing a very clear line between metaphysics and physics. Is that right?
Precisely. The fundamental error of mortals, in Parmenides' view, isn't necessarily that their specific physical theories are wrong within their own domain. They might actually be quite accurate descriptions of appearances. Their crucial error lies in their foundational assumption that categories like coming to be, perishing, motion, and plurality are applicable to ultimate reality, to being itself. They commit what we might call a category mistake. They try to explain being, which is singular and unchanging, using tools and concepts that are only suitable for explaining becoming, which is plural and always in flux. This points to what some scholars call Parmenides' general zetetic principle, the idea that any inquiry must be governed by norms that are proper to the domain of its object. Think of it this way. You wouldn't use a microscope to study galaxies, right? Or a telescope to examine a cell. Just as you use different methods for astronomy versus biology, Parmenides insisted you need different intellectual tools and different categories of explanation for understanding unchanging ultimate being versus the changing phenomenal world of appearances. He's demanding methodological rigor.
Okay, so the doxa is veridical. It's truthful or legitimate within its own domain. It's a true and potentially accurate account of the world of appearances, the realm of becoming. But the deception happens when you confuse the two domains. When you mistake the study of appearances for the study of ultimate unchanging reality, this means Parmenides is setting up separate but equally legitimate spheres. Metaphysics, governed by pure reason, and physics governed by principled sense-based investigation. The doxa in this reading isn't just a warning, it's his groundbreaking blueprint for how physics should be done. Given the strictures and insights revealed in the aletheia, it's a sophisticated two-tier system for understanding reality. Okay, so now let's explore how this new understanding of Parmenides completely changes the story of Empedocles and Anaxagoras. The traditional view always had them reacting against Parmenides' radical conclusions, remember, almost desperately trying to save the plural changing world from being dismissed as just an illusion by his powerful arguments. It paints them as philosophical firefighters battling to put out the Eleatic blaze.
Indeed. According to that long-standing account, the pluralists recognized the logical force, the intellectual power of Parmenides' arguments in the aletheia. They understood that his deductions about what is being singular, unchanging, eternal, they were incredibly compelling, almost irrefutable on their own terms. However, the traditional narrative says they simply could not accept the radical conclusion that the plural, changing world of sense experience, the very world we live in and see, is just an illusion. Parmenides' strict denial of motion, change, and plurality seem to make natural science, which takes these very phenomena as its subject an impossible venture, a dead end. So the challenge for Empedocles and Anaxagoras was therefore seen as constructing a cosmology that could somehow reconcile the Eleatic demand for an eternal, unchanging reality with the undeniable evidence of our senses that the world is multiple and in constant flux.
Right. So the pluralistic systems,
Yeah.
the ones that posited multiple basic entities instead of just one, they were seen as clever intellectual compromises.
Yeah.
Brilliant philosophical maneuvering designed to carve out a space for physics in the overwhelming shadow of Parmenides' monolithic being. They were portrayed as brave innovators trying to find a loophole in Parmenides' ironclad logic, almost like intellectual escape artists.
Yeah.
But you're suggesting this isn't quite right, that there's a central, undeniable contradiction in this traditional narrative that just begs for reevaluation.
This is precisely where the deep and, I think, revealing internal tension in the traditional narrative becomes really apparent, almost glaringly obvious once you see it. While supposedly rejecting Parmenides' philosophy and attempting to save the phenomena from him, the pluralists, both Empedocles and Anaxagoras, meticulously obey his most fundamental and revolutionary law, which is the absolute prohibition on genuine generation and destruction. Coming to be from nothing or perishing into nothing. This isn't a subtle point they adopt. It's the absolute cornerstone of Parmenides' Aletheia.
You're talking about Parmenides' core argument in the Aletheia, right? That bedrock principle that what is cannot come from what is not, nor can it perish into what is not. That, for Parmenides, is the ultimate, non-negotiable truth about reality. Nothing truly comes into existence from absolute nothingness, and nothing truly vanishes into absolute nothingness. It's a kind of conservation of being.
And this is the very principle that both Empedocles and Anaxagoras explicitly and foundationally adopt in their own cosmologies. It's right there in the fragments. Empedocles, for instance, asserts that his four roots, earth, air, fire, and water, they never cease their continual interchange, but the roots themselves are always changeless. They don't change their fundamental nature. For him, there is only a mingling and interchange of what has been mingled, not true creation or death of the underlying stuff. He's saying that what we perceive as things coming into being or passing away is merely a rearrangement of these eternal, unchanging roots. Anaxagoras is even more direct, even more emphatic about it. He states, quote, "The Greeks are wrong to accept coming to be and perishing, for no thing comes to be, nor does it perish. Instead," he says, "everything only experiences mingling and separation." Rearrangement again. These aren't minor concessions to Parmenides. These are explicit, direct endorsements of his most revolutionary metaphysical principle.
Wow. So this isn't refutation or clever circumvention at all. It's a direct, faithful application of the central conclusion of the Aletheia. They're basic entities, Empedocles' four roots and Anaxagoras' infinite seeds. They are specifically designed to possess the very Eleatic properties that Parmenides argues must belong to any true reality. They're eternal, unchanging in their own nature, whole. This profound paradox, the supposed rejection of Parmenides' strict numerical monism, while simultaneously accepting his foundational premise about no absolute coming to be, it really points to a fundamental misreading of the whole historical situation. It practically screams that the pluralists were not rejecting Parmenides' core philosophy at all. They were applying his principles to the natural world of change and diversity. And this is precisely where the veridical reading of the Doxa comes in and provides the missing piece of the puzzle, right? Revealing Parmenides' active role in actually enabling this shift. Okay, so if the Doxa is Parmenides' own positive cosmological program, legitimate attempt to explain the world of appearances, how does that make Empedocles and Anaxagoras direct continuations rather than just reactions against his philosophy? What's the key concept here? The intellectual unlock that reveals this new perspective on their relationship.
Well, the key seems to lie in a crucial philosophical distinction, one that's been really illuminated by contemporary scholars, particularly Patricia Curd. It's the distinction between numerical monism and predicational monism. Numerical monism is the more radical claim, the one easily misunderstood, that exactly one thing exists, a single, undifferentiated being, full stop. This is often what people think Parmenides argued for. Predicational monism, however, is a different, more subtle criterion. It's about what counts as a basic entity. It states that each thing that is can be only one thing. It can hold only the one predicate that indicates what it is. It must be internally consistent.
Okay, meaning a true what is, a fundamental reality, must be of a single, unified nature, utterly consistent within itself. It can't be a contradictory mix of properties, like it can't be fundamentally hot and fundamentally cold at the same time in the same respect. So it defines the kind of thing something must be to be considered a basic reality. It must have this internal coherence rather than dictating how many such fundamental things can exist. Is that right?
Precisely. The arguments of the Aletheia rigorously establish the necessity of predicational monism for any basic being. That's what the logic demonstrates. Any fundamental reality must be singular in its nature without internal contradictions or opposing predicates. For example, what is cannot be both moving and at rest in its fundamental nature. But, and this is absolutely crucial, the Aletheia's arguments do not, as has often been assumed for centuries, logically compel numerical monism. It is entirely possible, entirely consistent with Parmenides' logic, for a plurality of predicationally one things to exist. Each individual thing is singular and internally consistent in its nature, but there can be more than one of them making up reality. And Parmenides herself provides the very first example of this principle in action within his own poem. Right there in the Doxa. Remember, the Doxa's cosmology is founded on two such entities, light and night. The goddess describes them as each being everywhere the same as itself, but not the same as the other. They are two distinct, separate entities, yet each one is individually predicationally unified. They serve as the basis for a pluralistic cosmos in his own model. Each has a single, unified nature or predicate, but they are clearly two distinct fundamental forms. The pluralists, therefore, didn't need to break with Parmenidean logic to posit a plurality of basic beings. They simply had to follow the example set by Parmenides himself in his own account of the phenomenal world. It's a revelation when you see it that way.
Right, light and night. They each hold that single unified predicate, but they are clearly two distinct things that interact to create the world we see. So the pluralists didn't need to break with Parmenidean logic to posit a plurality. They just followed his own example, which was already laid out right there in the Doxa. This makes so much more sense than the traditional story of them trying to defy him or find loopholes. It completely reframes the whole intellectual landscape.
Exactly. And viewed through this lens, Empedocles' system no longer looks like a radical departure at all. Instead, it appears as a direct and systematic expansion of the cosmological model presented in the Doxa. He takes Parmenides' foundational structure for explaining the world of becoming, and he brilliantly developed its key components into a more robust, more empirically tuned system.
How so? What are the specific ways he builds on Parmenides' Doxa? Can you give us some concrete examples of this development? Does he expand it?
Okay, first, he expands the number of basic elements. That's the most obvious change. He replaces Parmenides' elemental duality of light, fire, and night earth with his canonical theory of four material roots. These are fire, air, water, and earth. More tangible, observable elements, familiar from everyday experience, right? But crucially, just like their Parmenidean predecessors, light and night, these roots are eternal, ungenerated, and indestructible. They are predicationally unified entities that satisfy those strict Iliadic criteria for being. They don't come into being or pass away themselves. All phenomenal change everything we see happening in the world, from plants growing to objects moving, from mountains forming to snow melting, is explained, just as it was hinted in the Doxa, as their mingling and separation. It's all just rearrangement, combination, dispersal of these fundamental roots, not true creation or destruction.
Okay, so same fundamental rules as Parmenides established in the Aletheia and first applied in the Doxa, but with more players in the game, basically. 4 roots instead of 2 forms, which allows for a richer, more nuanced explanation of the diverse world around us. It feels like an incremental step, a logical progression, rather than some revolutionary leap away from Parmenides. It's like Parmenides 2.0, maybe.
Kind of, yeah. Parmenides 2.0 is a good way to put it. And second, Empedocles refines and, importantly, naturalizes the motive cause for these elements. Where the Doxa somewhat mysteriously posits that central goddess or divine power guiding the mixture of light and night, a more mythological explanation, Empedocles introduces 2 immanent, material, and opposing cosmic forces. These are love, Philotes, which causes attraction and mingling of the roots, bringing them together, and strife, Nikos, which causes repulsion and their separation, pulling them apart. Now, these aren't external deities pulling strings. They are inherent active principles within the cosmos itself, constantly at work cyclically. This move from a possibly transcendent, maybe personified deity to immanent, mechanistic forces marks a clear and deliberate step. It's a step toward a more systematic and recognizably scientific physics, directly building on that Parmenidean foundation laid out in the Doxa. It makes the cosmos operate according to internal natural laws, which is a significant step forward for explanatory power.
Okay, then Anaxagoras comes along and takes this pluralizing logic and just radicalizes it even further. pushing the boundaries of the Parmenidean framework in a really profound way. How does he manage that while still apparently staying within this Eleatic legacy? What's his unique contribution?
Well, he, too, absolutely adheres to the Parmenidean prohibition on absolute generation and destruction. He states it explicitly, all change is merely rearrangement of what already is. He embraces that Eleatic criterion for basic entities completely, but he dramatically expands the number of basic entities beyond anything imagined by Parmenides or even Empedocles. Instead of 2 forms or 4 elements, he posits an infinite number of basic seeds or portions of every conceivable quality. Think hot, cold, wet, dry, bright, dark, flesh, bone, hair, gold, silver, you name it. Literally, his idea is that everything contains a portion of everything else. It's a concept sometimes called homooumereity. So a piece of bread, in his view, contains tiny, imperceptible seeds of hair, bone, water, earth, everything, just dominated by bread seeds.
Infinite seeds. Wow. And any object's character is then explained by the predominance of certain qualities within it. Like he said, each is and was most manifestly those things of which there is most in it. So a piece of flesh has mostly flesh seeds, but also tiny bits of hair and bone and everything else, which are only revealed when we eat it and it becomes part of us, or when flesh transforms somehow. That's a pretty mind-bending way to explain diversity from an unchanging fundamental base, ensuring that nothing new ever truly comes to be from nothing.
It is mind-bending. But his most profound innovation, arguably, comes in his treatment of the motive cause, what makes things happen. He replaces Empedocles' 2 material forces, love and strife, with a single, unique principle, nous, which translates usually as mind or intellect. And crucially, nous is fundamentally different from all the other infinite seeds. It is completely unmixed with any of them. It's pure. It is self-ruling, autonomous, and it is external to the material chaos of seeds that it then organizes. How does it organize? By initiating a cosmic rotation, a vortex. This rotation then separates the various seeds out according to their properties, creating the ordered cosmos we observe from an initial undifferentiated mixture. It's a rational, ordering, principle-imposing structure.
Okay. So by making the motive cause non-material, intelligent, and transcendent, or at least separate from the mix, Anaxagoras addresses some of the potential problems in Empedocles' system. Like what exactly causes love and strife to act when they do? How do they achieve order, being just material forces? Anaxagoras introduces this teleological dimension, right? Mindset in order all things. That implies a purpose or design behind the cosmos. This really sounds like a sophisticated refinement within the Parmenidean framework. It shows how the inquiry into cause and order evolved from a mythological explanation in the Doxa to mechanistic forces in Empedocles and then to this intelligent organizing principle in Anaxagoras. It looks like a continuous, logical, philosophical journey, not a series of breaks.
Exactly. The developmental relationship between Parmenides' Doxa and the systems of his pluralist successors, Empedocles and Anaxagoras, it becomes unmistakably clear when we juxtapose their core principles side by side. This comparative framework really reveals not just a series of isolated breakthroughs, but a clear and logical progression. It shows a systematic evolution of pre-Socratic thought that we might have completely missed if we stuck only to the traditional narrative of rejection and reaction.
Okay, let's break that down, feature by feature, for you, our listener. Let's make these connections really explicit and show how this lineage unfolds. It's kind of like watching a family tree sprout different branches, but all coming from the same common root, the same DNA almost. All right, first, let's consider the metaphysical status of the phenomenal world. What do they think about the reality of the world we see? All 3 Parmenides, in the Doxa according to this reading, Empedocles and Anaxagoras, they all seem to agree on a crucial point, that the phenomenal world, the world of our senses, while definitely not the ultimate unchanging reality of the aletheia, is nonetheless a legitimate, real, and explicable domain. It's not just an illusion to be discarded, it's a valid subject for rigorous inquiry. This shared foundation is absolutely key to understanding their whole project.
Right. Then moving on to the nature and number of basic elements. What are the fundamental building blocks? Parmenides' Doxa grounds its explanation in 2 opposed forms, light fire and night earth, a duality. Empedocles then expands this, moving to his canonical 4 material roots, earth, air, fire, water, from 2 to 4. Anaxagoras radicalizes it further still, positing that infinite number of seeds or portions of every quality imaginable, from 4 to infinite. So you see a clear numerical and qualitative expansion here, a move towards greater complexity, presumably to better explain the rich diversity of the world we actually experience.
And crucially, when we look at the properties of these basic elements, all their basic entities, light, night, the 4 roots, the infinite seeds, they all share the exact Eleatic properties. The properties that Parmenides established as necessary for true being back in the aletheia. They are all conceived as eternal,
ungenerated, indestructible, and unchangeable in their own nature. This is direct, unwavering adherence to the Aletheia's core insight. These unchanging entities provide the stable bedrock for a world of apparent change without violating the fundamental rules of reality. They are the fixed points, the constants in a world of flux.
Mhm. Then there's the source of motion and change. What makes things happen? What drives the processes? This is where the evolution within this shared framework is particularly telling, I think. Parmenides' Doxa hints at that central goddess or divine power, maybe an inherent opposition between light and night, guiding the mixture. It's somewhat mythological, or at least not fully mechanistic. Empedocles then introduces his two external but material forces, love and strife, which are immanent within the cosmic process. They're more like physical forces. Anaxagoras culminates this line of thought with an external non-material intellect, Nous, which actively organizes the universe through rational action. This shows a clear progression in how causation itself is being conceived.
Yeah, that progression is really striking. From a somewhat mythological guide in the Doxa to mechanistic immanent forces in Empedocles to a transcendent intelligent mind in Anaxagoras, it clearly traces a path of increasing philosophical sophistication and abstraction in understanding causality, doesn't it? It feels like a journey from the mythological towards a more systematic, rational, and maybe even potentially teleological explanation of why the universe is the way it is.
Absolutely. And consistently across all three systems, the mechanism of change, how things actually transform, is explained as the mingling and separation of these basic entities. This is a direct adoption of language, maybe even pioneered by Parmenides in the Doxa, that perfectly conforms to his fundamental prohibition on absolute generation and destruction from the Aletheia. Nothing truly comes into being from nothing, and nothing truly perishes into nothing. It simply rearranges. Things mix, things unmix. This offers a really clever and logically coherent way to explain the apparent change we observe all around us without violating those deepest metaphysical truths established by the Aletheia. It's a solution that manages to satisfy both the demands of pure reason and the evidence of observation.
So in their response to the Parmenidean prohibition on coming to be from nothing, instead of trying to sneak generation in somehow, all three systems bypass the problem entirely. They do it by positing positive realities, forms, roots, seeds that interact, or by describing change as just a rearrangement of what is already there. They honor the core metaphysical rule laid out in the Aletheia while still successfully explaining the world of becoming, the world of physics. It's a brilliant way to have their philosophical cake and eat it too, really. They found a way for physics to exist rigorously within Parmenides' demanding metaphysical boundaries.
Indeed. This comparative framework, looking at them side by side, reveals a clear and logical progression. All three thinkers accept the fundamental premise that the phenomenal world, while not the ultimate reality described in the Aletheia, is nonetheless a real and explicable domain. It's worthy of study. They all ground this explanation in a plurality of basic entities that possess those Eleatic properties, being eternal and unchanging in their own nature. Each stage, from Parmenides' Doxa to Empedocles to Anaxagoras, represents a direct attempt to solve problems or refine explanations latent in the previous one, all while staying within the same fundamental cosmological framework established, arguably, in the Doxa. This shows a deep engagement, a systematic development over generations, not a simple rejection or a hostile reaction. It's a story of continuity, refinement, and evolution, not just revolution.
So what does this all mean then? For our understanding of ancient Greek philosophy, this veridical reading of Parmenides' Doxa, it seems like it's more than just, an alternative academic interpretation for a few specialists. It feels like a necessary corrective to a long-standing historical narrative. A narrative that truly obscured the depth and the actual nature of his influence. It paints a much richer, much more interconnected picture of early Greek thought, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It fundamentally transforms our image of Parmenides. Instead of seeing him as a philosophical dead end, someone who supposedly halted scientific inquiry by denying the very possibility of change, he emerges as the very progenitor, the wellspring of a new, more rigorous foundation for physics. He didn't just pose a problem, a philosophical Gordian knot that everyone else had to cut. He actually offered the beginning of a profound solution, a solution for how to rigorously understand the world of experience while respecting the demands of logic. He showed them how to look and what to look for in a way.
Right. It's like he provided this two-part instruction manual for reality. The Aletheia gave us the non-negotiable metaphysical rules, the necessary properties within basic explanatory entity that must exist, the fundamental nature of reality itself, the laws of being. And then the Doxa provided the first working model of a physics that obeyed those laws. a pluralistic, elemental cosmology capable of explaining change and diversity without violating that absolute Eleatic prohibition against coming to be from nothing. It's a complete conceptual package, really. A revolutionary way to reconcile pure reason and sensory observation.
Exactly. Empedocles and Anaxagoras, therefore, far from being defiant critics trying to save the phenomena from a hostile monism, they look much more like the first and second generations of true Parmenidean physicists. They accepted his stringent metaphysical criteria, the rules of reality established in the Aletheia, and they built directly upon his cosmological blueprint, the one found in the Doxa. They systematically expanded and refined its components. They weren't just responding to a challenge he threw down, they were inheriting a systematic approach, a framework that allowed them to develop natural philosophy in a truly groundbreaking way, consistent with his core insights.
What's truly fascinating here when you frame it like this is that Parmenides wasn't the great watershed that diverted the stream of early Ionian natural philosophy, forcing it into new, desperate channels. Instead, he was its new wellspring. He channeled it into a deeper, more logically sound riverbed. The riverbed of post-Eleatic physical theory. He gave it new life and a new, more rigorous direction, rather than stopping it dead in its tracks. He was the catalyst for a whole new era of scientific inquiry, arguably.
And this reinterpretation, this significant shift in understanding, it raises an important question for you, our listener, to think about. If foundational thinkers like Parmenides, whose influence has been interpreted in one particular way for centuries, can be so profoundly reinterpreted with new scholarly insights and closer readings, what other historical narratives in philosophy or elsewhere might we need to reconsider? How many other standard stories might be incomplete or misleading? And what does this tell us about the nature of philosophical progress itself? Is it always about overturning established ideas, a constant revolution? Or is it often about evolving within established frameworks, finding new depths and connections, and perhaps uncovering a hidden continuity that we missed before?
That's definitely something to ponder. Maybe as you look at the stars tonight, thinking about those ancient minds that first sought to understand their unchanging nature and the ever-changing cosmos around them. Thank you for joining us on this AI history of Western philosophy. We hope this exploration has pointed you towards the original sources and perhaps demonstrated some new possibilities for thought. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the history of ideas.